What makes a good technical photograph? Well, four things: correct exposure, maximum depth of field, free from distortion, and sharp focus. The next thing we're also concerned about is maximum depth of field. So my first question is, what is depth of field? Well, depth of field is the area in a photograph that's in sharp focus. So when you take a picture of something, you're going to have part of it, you could even have all of it, but you usually have part of it in focus. If you want a lot of area in focus from in front of you to behind your subject, that would be really deep depth of field. If all you have is just your subject in focus, very shallow depth of field. Well, for our use, whenever possible, we want as much depth of field as possible. And why is that? Because we don't want people claiming that we threw something out of focus on purpose so that it would be hard to see what was there. We want as much in sharp focus as possible. There are three things that affect depth of field. Some people call it range of sharpness. Those three things are the lens opening, the subject distance, how close you are to the subject you're focused on, and the focal length of the lens that you are using. Now, in this image, the tree is supposed to be what we're photographing, and the shaded area is what is in sharp focus. That's our depth of field. For lens opening, a large lens opening like an f2 gives us shallow depth of field, while a small lens opening like f16 gives us greater depth of field. The second thing that affects depth of field is the distance you are from what you're focusing on. So if you're up close, like 4 feet, you're going to be shallow. If you're at 10 feet and you focus on the same object, you get more depth of field. And if you're at 25 feet and focus on the same object, you get even better depth of field. So where do we see this in our line of work? Well, we see this in evidence photography when we do close-ups. You get in really close, you're only a few inches away, and your depth of field is very shallow. And then the third thing that affects depth of field is the focal length of the lens you're using. As you can see in this, 135 millimeter telephoto lens gives us shallow depth of field. A normal lens gives us greater depth of field, and the wide angle gives us even more depth of field. And where do we see this mostly? Well, if you ever do surveillance photography, you'll deal with shallow depth of field. You have that 600 millimeter lens and you're focused on someone's face from a distance because you don't want them to know you're photographing them, and they take a step backwards, all of a sudden they're out of focus. So now we have these three things that affect depth of field. For us, we're only concerned about one of them, and that is the lens opening. Because subject distance and focal length is pretty much going to be determined ahead of time, and we can't really change it. What I mean by that is subject distance. If I need to do a close-up, I got to get in close. I can't say, oh, this fingerprint, I have such shallow depth of field, I think I'll step back 10 feet and take the picture. No, that you won't get anything. Focal length, we already talked about this. We're going to be at the 50 millimeter equivalent for all of our pictures, except for when we need to go wide angle for overviews. So the one place that we can control depth of field is with our lens opening. So basically, when we can, we should try using the smaller lens openings like f16, f22, and f11 to get better depth of field. Let's look at an example. Here we have a photograph of a lamppost. It's in sharp focus, but notice how out of focus the background is. Well, that's because I used an f2.8 as my lens aperture. My critical focus was on the lamppost, so it's fine, but my depth of field is so shallow that everything in the background's out of focus. Instead, if I take that same picture, but use an f22, I can still be focused on the lamppost, but now look at the background. It's all in focus as well. And in fact, if I'm using f22, I could actually focus more over here because my depth of field is coming both directions. So the lamppost is still going to be in focus, even though I'm not focused critically on it. but that'll also help to extend my depth of field further out. So you can play with your depth of field that way. You don't have to focus exactly on your main object if you know that object's going to be within your depth of field. So when we can, now often we can't. When you're doing close-up photography, the depth of field is really not going to change much with your f-stop. We try, use f/22 if you can, but whether or not it shows much is going to be a good question. Let's say that you're doing night photography. A lot of times with night photography, we've got our lens wide open just to be able to take pictures. So you just forget about the depth of field. Now, often that kind of picture that I just mentioned, available light outdoors at night, we're taking a picture of a large area, maybe a traffic collision scene, and we've got the street lights lighting it. Using a flash won't be effective, but if we just use ambient light, it'll be fine. Well, there we're probably a distance away from things. And so that one factor of depth of field that we already talked about, distance from subject, is going to actually improve our depth of field. So being at f4 or 4.5 isn't that bad in that situation because we're further away. So these things all work together. Sometimes we just can't get f/22, f/16, or f/11, but when we can, it's a good idea to do it to eliminate these issues. So we talked about the first two things we need for a good technical photograph: correct exposure, maximum depth of field. The third thing is free from distortion. Now, distortion can come in a couple of ways. One is with lens selection. To show what the lens can do as far as distortion, I'm going to take 3 photographs here, all from the same location. The first one, I'm going to use my normal lens, and this is the resulting picture. Now, if you and I could go and stand right here now where this picture was taken and hold the picture next to us, you would say, this looks like the picture and what I see are very similar perspective wise. So you look at things like the distance between the posts from this fence to the fence back there, and maybe even the distance in the foreground, okay, to get an idea. Now for my next picture, I'm going to take a photograph with a telephoto lens, and not a very long telephoto, just a 100 millimeter lens. So this was taken with a 50 millimeter lens and with a 100 millimeter, just a short telephoto. Here is what you get. Now notice, distances look shorter. The distance between these posts look a little shorter. The distance between this fence and that fence looks a lot shorter. The distance in the foreground looks shorter. And then for the third picture, I'm going to use a 28 millimeter lens, a wide angle lens, still in the same location. Now look at the distances. So we want to use that normal lens whenever possible, because distance, first of all, is often misleading in pictures. And secondly, you don't want to distort the distances to make it even more difficult for people to understand. So use a normal lens whenever possible. Now, sometimes we have to use a wide angle lens. We're going to use one usually for the interior shots for overviews. So here's a photograph that's a bit distorted. You notice that it appears that the doorway, the door itself at the top, is wider than the door down lower. Well, the door isn't distorted. It's the photograph, the angle. It's because I'm using a wide angle lens. In this situation, I'm in a very small dormitory room, and I'm actually all the way against the other corner, and I'm trying to show part of this room, and that's all I could get with a 28 millimeter lens. Now, in order to have this result where it gets wider at the top and narrower at the bottom, that's because I pointed the camera down slightly. When you point the camera down slightly with a wide angle lens, things at the top get wider. If you want to try to minimize that distortion some, you try to shoot straight out and keep the lines more parallel. It'll still be distorted widthwise, but you don't get that appearance up and down. But here I wanted to show more down low than up high. So distortion. So where was this vehicle parked? It was parked on this hill, or was it? Actually, I've seen pictures like this where someone just snaps the picture and their camera isn't even straight. So what I recommend you do is to get in the habit of pausing before you snap the picture to ensure that you frame the image the way you want it. Look in all four corners. Now, when you're first learning, you'll take a little bit longer to do this. After that, it may be something that is subconscious. You don't really have to think about it much unless there's evidence, and then you start to think about it. But regardless, if you stop and look in all four corners and say, is this really what I want to show? You might see that Detective Joe Brown's shoes are sticking in the picture, and you have to say, hey, Joe, step back. You're in my shot. Or you notice over on the left over here that there's an arm of the victim going across the gutter there. You say, well, wait a minute, if I just move over a little bit, I can get the body and the car at the same time, a good relationship photograph. Look at what you're actually photographing. Some people, they just get so caught up with, I got to get the, the green light to light up, and I got to make sure this is right and that's right. And I better push the button before I lose it, click. And they're not even paying attention to what they're really photographing. So take your time until you get really comfortable with doing this and frame your picture. Another distortion can actually be the height of the camera from the ground. So here we have an image of a path in a park. And let's say some kid on a skateboard wiped out, broke his arm in 3 places. Now the parents are suing the city. So the city asks you to go out and take a photograph. Well, you better believe if they're suing the city, they're going to have an attorney. The attorney is going to contact a civil evidence photographer to go out and photograph this area as well. And we've all heard of cases where someone has taken a photograph and they can make a crack in a sidewalk look like the Grand Canyon. And you can do that with lens selection, camera angle, lighting. So you don't want to go out and take a picture that exaggerates something that's not there. And so here's the first photograph taken at my eye level. Now I'm going to take a second picture with the camera up higher. See, that gives a little different flavor to this, and then down lower. So you should take a picture from eye level whenever possible. Now, we do have to take pictures under couches and on and on and on, but when you're taking pictures at eye level, it makes it easier for people to understand what they're looking at. And when you don't take something at eye level, put it in your notes, why you did it, what you're doing, some kind of explanation. Now, of course, the best picture would have been from the side, a side view, so you can actually see the angle, but maybe you don't have the opportunity to do that. Maybe there's shrubbery or hillsides or whatever in the way. Now, granted, they will have an expert who comes out and uses surveying instruments and plumb bobs and angle finders and gets into the courtroom and says, well, there was a 17.9% grade. Jury doesn't understand that. But if you have a photograph that's accurate, then it makes sense. So eye level. Now, you might be tall and I might be short. What's eye level? Well, just somewhere in normal, not one spot is eye level. It's just general eye level for most people. Here we have something that looks like distortion, but it actually is not. Here, what I want you to see is we have a matchbook, and then this is a fuse trail. So there was a fuse that went to the gas filler tube on this parked vehicle. So look at here, the fuse burning pattern is wide here and narrow down there. So you might think, well, we got distortion. No, this is actually perspective. Things closer to you look larger than things further away. When I get closer to you, this camera, I look terrible. Bigger, I look better further away, I'm smaller. You stand out on the street and the cars right next to you are gigantic. You look way down the street and they're these little bitty cars and you wonder how people can get in them. That's just perspective. So things further away are going to be smaller. You cannot correct that and you shouldn't even try. But what this picture does is show direction, and then you take a picture from the side, and that pretty much better shows how long this is and even how wide it is. So we covered 3 of the 4. Technical photographs are correctly exposed, maximum depth of field, free from distortion, and the last is sharp focus. Very important. So we want to make sure that we are in sharp focus. So what do we do with that? Well, one issue is making sure the camera is steady. When you use slower shutter speeds, you can still get a little bit of camera movement during the exposure, and that can blur, in other words, throw it out of focus. So that's one issue. So using a tripod whenever necessary. If you go below a 60th of a second, you should probably use a tripod, unless you're really good at holding the camera steady. I mean, you can practice with that. If you can lean against something while you're holding the camera, that can work well too. There are monopods where they screw in the bottom of the camera and it's just one leg, and that can help you to steady the camera on 30th of a second, even a 15th of a second. Some of it also depends on how heavy your camera is, and especially how long and heavy your lens is. When you have a heavy lens, you want to make sure you're shooting at least the focal length in shutter speed. So if you have your zoom lens on 31 millimeters because you want to be 50 millimeters, you should use at least a 50th of a second shutter speed. So that would be 60th, because that's the closest one. You go a little higher. If you are using the equivalent of a 125 millimeter lens, then you'd want to make sure that you're using at least 125th of a second as your slowest handheld shutter speed. Also, squeezing the button slightly, lightly, instead of jamming the button, that also minimizes movement and also focus carefully. Now, this brings up autofocus. The autofocus on most of these cameras is pretty darn good, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it'll focus past where you want it to focus. Maybe it's off a little bit. Maybe your subject is not in the center, and so it's focusing somewhere else. Sometimes it won't focus at all. Most focusing systems are looking for contrast. So if you're trying to photograph a blank wall, sometimes it can't even focus because there's no contrast. It doesn't know where the wall is. And if you're outdoors at night and you're trying to focus, if it can't see any contrast, it won't autofocus. Normally for night photography, we have to turn the autofocus off. So make sure that your focus is where it should be. Always realize you can shut off autofocus and manually focus for your photograph. And many times that is the better way to go. So there you have technical photography. Correct exposure, maximum depth of field, free from distortion, and sharp focus.